Alrighty, welcome back, everybody. This is my second attempt at recording this because my phone is not correctly connected. Sometimes it helps to see me gesticulate madly with my hands, to make a point. Okay, enough of my rambling. We're on to chapter 2, okay? And we are going very fast, I understand that, but it's the nature of a class like this. So, chapter 2 is all about obstacles to critical thinking, right? So we're going to learn some positive methods as well, right? How do you be a good critical thinker? But there are certain ways in which we're wired to reason badly in all sorts of ways, where we make an inference or we begin to believe something, but not for good reasons. Or perhaps we argue for something, uh, also for not good reasons. And a lot of times it's hardwired psychological stuff, just the way that we are wired as human beings. So some of this is coming from cognitive science. Okay. So chapter objectives, I sort of tightened them from the book. The book is a little bit more detailed, but there's basically 4 different parts, or is it 5? 4 or 5. All hail the self. So self-interested thinking can be an obstacle to critical thinking. Okay, so we'll address that, and then there's group thinking, or the way in which individuals exist in groups can also affect your critical thinking in a negative way. Okay, so by yourself and in a group, both of these cause certain problems, right? Some of them are personal ego problems. It's so funny how so many of the world religions and then critical thinking as well say we have an ego problem, right? So even in a class like this, we're being encouraged to reach deeper and to not be so ego driven, because it distorts our thinking, right? But our thoughts can also be, our reasoning can also be distorted by being in groups or grouping other people in various ways. Okay. Then there are these really tough ones that are, again, mostly identified by cognitive science, right? So there's a lot of science backing these ideas, the way in which we go wrong, right? So we'll look at confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and the availability error, which is sometimes called the availability heuristic. Okay. And then, oh yeah, we do have 5, because the final one is philosophical obstacles. But we have a nice. It's good that critical thinking textbooks are getting updated to include at least a little bit of guidance for how to navigate the online world, right? So your brain on social media will look at certain things that are especially pernicious in social media and in being online. Some of us are chronically online. I kind of sometimes am, sometimes I'm better. But so we're very much uh, in danger of these things occurring. The mere exposure effect, the illusion of truth effect, the false consensus effect, and the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect, I don't know why they put it in the social media area. It didn't need to, because that's not a particularly exactly for social media. It's a general effect, but that's all right. And then philosophical obstacles. And this one's very interesting because, my background is philosophy, and the textbook is taking a very specific philosophical stance on things. As a philosopher, though, I'm used to arguing from different perspectives as well. And so, this whole area of the philosophical obstacles, take it with a grain of salt. It won't have a huge impact on everyday critical thinking, but there are at least some interesting things to think about there. Okay, the philosophical obstacles of subjective relativism and social relativism, and maybe skepticism. But for skepticism, it kind of depends what you mean by skepticism, right? Okay, so we're going to try to cover all of these, and I'll try to go fast. So these are self-driven distortions of reasoning, right? Ways in which we go bad in our thinking. We can think in a self-interested way, right? Which is not necessarily bad, right? That you're taking care of yourself and you're the captain of your ship, like we said, right? So this is not against autonomy. Uh, what this specifically means is believing that something is true because you want it to be true, right? Uh, Kids are sometimes very good at this, right? They'll just create what they want to be true and then believe in it because you want it to be true, right? Sometimes people say, "Well, I wouldn't want to live in a world where this didn't exist or this wasn't true." Right? Well, the fact that you don't want to live in a world where that's not true doesn't mean that it's true, right? So that's the problem here is that whether or not something is true or false depends on the evidence. It depends on the reasons that are out there. But the fact that you want it to be true is not really something that makes it true, right? For many of these things, there will be these kind of interesting exceptions, right? So maybe you're interpreting this as you envision a goal for yourself that isn't true right now, but by envisioning it, you can make it happen, right? There's something to that. You don't have to get magical about it, like with the law of attraction. You could just say, people can be motivated by dreams and by visions that aren't true in the moment, and I think that's right? But that's not really what we're talking about here, right? We're not really talking about making something become true because of your sheer belief and dedication in that, right? This goal that you've set for yourself. That's totally fine. This is just, hey, here's a factual question, right? Is this true? Is this false? Well, how you feel about it doesn't really matter. It's going to be true or false independently of your feelings. This is related to something that I've called epistemological hedonism, right? Epistemological has to do with knowledge and how we form beliefs. Hedonism is the philosophy of pleasure, right? Of feeling good. So you put the two together, it's a kind of believing something true because it feels good to believe it, right? That's a specific version of it as well. And so we might think of very philosophical questions like, does God exist? Is there an afterlife? Those are tough philosophical questions, right? And you can enter into the fray of discussion, right? That the great thinkers of the mind have thought about this issue in one way and another way by providing reasons and arguments. Does the fact that you like an afterlife or that you don't like an afterlife, does that determine whether there is an afterlife? Those seem to be disconnected, right? How you feel about the truth is different from the truth itself. Something doesn't become true just by wanting it to be true, by the fact that it comforts you if it's true. That's why for some people, philosophy is just not something they like because it often makes you go down paths where you have to contend with perhaps uncomfortable truths or uncomfortable beliefs. So, you can live your life how you want. This class can't tell you how to live. But if you're interested in what the truth is, then at least consider this, right? Are you just believing this because you want it to be true versus do you have good reasons to believe that it is true? Okay. Uh, so that's sort of a self-driven thing, right? It's to gratify the ego in some way, right? Your ego doesn't like some sort of idea, so it just makes you think that something else is true. Okay. So critical thinking can get undermined, right? But in general, facts are facts, independently of your feelings about the facts. But again, always, there's always these small kind of maybe exceptions, like I said earlier, really believing that you can do something, right, can sometimes enable you to do that thing. You can make it become true. But that's different from what we're talking about here. I hope that's clear. I hope the distinction is different, is clear to you, that there is a difference between these things. And when we're thinking in a self-interested way, then it's easier to ignore evidence as well, right? That we don't even want to look at the evidence, even if it's staring us right in the face. Sometimes you just don't want it to be true, right? And I'm sure you can think of examples like this. Sometimes relationships are like that, right? Where maybe you know that you have to get out of this relationship. You absolutely, maybe you're even in danger, you can know that it's true and the evidence is right in your face, but you somehow just don't act like you really believe it, right? You in some way believe some picture that you've made up in your mind, some sort of fantasy, because it serves your ego better, right? Or it protects you, right? It doesn't have to be so negative. Sometimes it's just a way that we protect ourselves. And when the ego gets threatened, when you really feel threatened, there's something that actually happens in your body, right? There's a physical change. When the ego feels threatened and you go into a kind of flight or fight response, things change in your brain and you start processing with different areas in your brain than you normally do. Right. And the sort of the more animal like part of you sort of takes over. The irrational or non-rational side of you starts to take over. And that literally interferes with your critical thinking and with your rational thinking. So again, I always have to make sure that he's being heard correctly. This is not saying you can't have strong feelings, right? This is not saying that it's bad to feel passionate or to feel angry. We're not saying that. Right? We're just saying that if what you need to do is to think clearly, then it's better to not be in this kind of a state, right? That's what we're saying here. Like, for example, right, this could happen if you get flustered or embarrassed in public, right? Then something happens. Maybe this has happened to you, or maybe you just get stage fright, right? Your adrenaline goes up. You start kind of hyperventilating, right? You feel flushed. It kind of feels like the beginning of a panic attack, maybe, right? That kind of a feeling. When that's happening, that's a signal, right? These are biometric changes, and they signal the fact that this other part of your brain is taking over, right? And the rational part of your thinking is being subdued. And when you're like that, you're also more likely to engage in bad reasoning or bad faith arguing, right? You might just, instead of trying to clearly present what you think is true with the reasons that show that it is true, right? When you are feeling threatened, and maybe this happens because your belief wasn't all that well thought through, right? Maybe somebody exposed you. That's also possible. You should be thankful for the people that expose you, right? It's good. That's how you learn, right? But that's often not our reaction because our ego feels threatened when it looks as though uh, we don't know what we're talking about. Right? We get embarrassed and we get flustered, and then that can create more problems, right? So you might resort to just name calling or things like that, right? Or bringing up something that's totally irrelevant to the issue, some sort of distraction, right, from what's happening. These are all things that can happen that get in the way. So, a very clear physiological, physical, psychological way in which, when we feel threatened in that way, especially publicly, right, or maybe even thinking about something by yourself at home, maybe you think about something and it threatens something within you. It makes you feel not good. So you look away, right? It's possible for that to happen. So, passion and outrage, I want to reiterate, these kinds of things can sometimes be useful and sometimes they're just healthy to express, right? So, this is not against emotions at all. It just means if it's time to think clearly and rationally, then be in a state where you can do that, right? And also, if you are arguing with somebody else, you know, uh, then being really passionate and having a bunch of outrage that this person disagrees with you, those are useless if you can't present reasons for what you believe, right? This can often happen. I see these things that people they tape these interactions between professional debaters and then everyday people, and they argue about some political points. But it often happens that, of course, the professional debater, they have their stuff ready, right? They have their main conclusion that they're arguing for, and they have a coherent argument to present in favor of it. right? They are usually ready, right? Maybe that there's something wrong with the argument, right? Maybe one of the premises is false. Maybe the reasoning is incorrect. We're not saying anything about the quality of the argument, but the professional debater will often have an argument or a set of arguments ready. And then along comes somebody who disagrees with this person who's got all the arguments, right? And it's all being videotaped, right? It's all being recorded. And this person really, really feels that this person is wrong about their political view, right? Passionately, they're like, this person is so wrong, but this person is not ready. They don't really know what they believe, and they're not ready to defend it, right? And then this person comes along and presents some arguments and easily picks apart whatever this person said. And then this person is being publicly humiliated. And then, you know what happens next, right? You get flushed, you get all exasperated, and you start saying things that don't really make sense, that are not relevant to the issue. And you might feel inside, that person might feel like, but I'm on the right side here, right? I'm on the right side politically. This person is hateful. This person is biased, etc., etc. You may be right, but that outrage and that raw passion is not a substitute for being ready with a coherent argument, right? You should be able to, if you're going to have fruitful discussions with people, you should be able to, if you're going to be passionate, right, publicly, then you should be ready to present an argument for your case. You can try different techniques for pressuring people. Right? If you don't have an argument ready, you can try to emotionally manipulate people. Right? That's a possible technique. Sometimes we don't want to face the truth about ourselves. Right? This is kind of a very personal kind of a thing. You know, if you can't think critically and clearly about your own life, then there's a risk, right, that you're not going to really grow and mature as a human being. Right, you might stagnate, right? And that's not how I assume most people agree that it's good to progress and learn and grow as you go along. But if your own character and your own life and your own choices are not something that you can look at, uh, you know, in an honest way, then you risk not maturing and not growing, right, as an individual. Right? So try to avoid that as a good critical thinker, right? What do you care about? You care about the evidence, you care about the reasons, you care about the supports, right? Uh, why is this thing true or likely to be true, right? And you ignore irrelevant things like, do I want it to be true? That's not the question. Right? The question, do I want it to be true, is a different question from, is it true, right? And so you have to sort of have an attitude, right? That you are a person who's interested in the truth, and you're interested in knowing and learning, right? And finding and identifying the good reasons to believe something. So it's sort of a character almost that you try to embody as a critical thinker, right? You are this type of person who cares about the truth, who does not care about irrelevant reasons, right? Don't waste my time with irrelevant reasons, right? Give me reasons to believe that something is true. Having this kind of an overall philosophical attitude is nice for this, right? Plato has this quote attributed to him anyway. Philosophy begins in wonder, right? You have a general desire to know the truth, right? The word philosophy means love of knowledge, right? Where you want to know what's true. And if you have a sense of wonder, right, then you look at everything with an open mind of like, well, what's really true? Can I figure out how things work? What is everything like? What are the best reasons to believe something? That involves critical thinking. So we have all hail the self, now all hail the group, right? So this is group thinking, group dynamics, and things like that. How that how that interferes with our critical thinking, right? So groupthink occurs when you are in a particular social group And we often in life are committed to getting our beliefs from a particular group. Now, maybe we compartmentalize, right? Maybe we say, well, I get my religious beliefs from my church, and I get my scientific beliefs from going to college and reading science books, right? So you might compartmentalize, but nevertheless, you can end up in a particular group that you feel identity with, and you might get your beliefs from them for that reason, right? And this has to do with, again, our these innate capacities that we feel this deep need as human beings to feel part of a community, but then also a community that's a reliable source of truth, right? We're social beings, right? And we have to sort of compartmentalize knowledge a little bit, or we have to outsource it a little bit, right? You can't figure out all the knowledge in the world on your own, right? You get it from other people. We rely on secondhand knowledge all the time. And so we end up part of communities or groups, social groups, that we end up trusting to give us the truth, right? But that can conflict with critical thinking because it's not always the case that one particular group is more likely to have it correct than some other particular group. In some cases, right, the community of scientists is a good place to go to if you want scientific knowledge. But a lot of times there's social groups uh, where it's not like that at all, right? So this goes back to this idea of the mental map that you have, right? All the set of beliefs that guide all your decision making and all your behavior, your whole life, basically, right? The shape that your life will take, and that's something that you get from wherever you happen to be born, right? And that's kind of a matter of accident, right? Your first initial set of beliefs that you get bombarded with, right? It's a kind of an accident of birth. But then we also end up in social groups kind of by accident, right? And then we become devoted to those groups, or we identify with that group, and then we end up inheriting beliefs from those groups just as uncritically in some cases as when you are a child, right? So here's a specific example of how this could happen. Some people identify very strongly with their political affiliation, right? So let's say in the United States, uh, I think maybe people are getting fed up with with this way of classifying things, right? Democrats, Republicans, but let's just go with that, right? That's still the main thing. Uh, so, if you're in the U.S. and you really identify, right, you're one of these people that's passionate about your political side, and you really identify with that side. You're really, yep, that's me. I'm a Democrat. Or yes, that's me. I'm a Republican. Right? What can happen is that you get most of your beliefs from that particular group, right? And not just beliefs, but also interpretations of beliefs, or interpretations of what the world is like, frameworks, ways of thinking about things, right? Ways of the way we frame social issues. All these things can come from a very one-sided direction if you get most of those beliefs from your particular social group, right? So not everyone does this, right? Maybe not even most. I don't know. There's no way to know this, but we know that this can happen, right? That because you are so devoted to this particular cause and this group and this community, then you end up filtering knowledge or beliefs through that group. And that's just a danger, right? That's just a danger that occurs when you identify strongly with a group. You kind of assume that they are a reliable source of truth. But in many cases, to know whether something is true, you have to do a little bit of work. You got to be a critical thinker. You got to be a caretaker of your map, right? Rather than just inheriting it from the groups that you happen to be in. Right? The fact that you are devoted to this group does not mean that the beliefs that they are giving you are true, right? Or that the ideas that they're giving you, or the explanations, or the interpretations, etc., etc. And peer pressure can make this even more difficult, right? So if you're in this group and maybe you're already devoted to the group, but also all the people in that group kind of want you to believe the same thing, right? And so you can also try to use the dynamic of groups to influence people to believe what you want to believe, right? So if we switch the role a little bit from, here I am in a group, should I believe what they're giving me? Now instead, you're in a group and you are trying to pressure people, right? So you might say, hey, everybody knows this, right? Or everybody does this, right? You should believe this thing, or you should do this thing, or you should agree with this course of action because this is what we all believe, right? So you're appealing to how popular a belief is or how common a particular practice is. But popularity of beliefs doesn't really determine truth, right? Used to be very popular to believe that the sun goes around the earth, right? Most people used to believe that. And now we kind of have figured out that that's not the way it works, right? If you don't like that example, you can come up with a million other examples where people believed things that are just known to be incorrect today. There's this danger of tribalism, right? Again, going with these feelings of passion and devotion, right? You identify so strongly with your group and you feel like that group reflects your own worth, right? So you just kind of see your group as inherently better than the other group. But that happens regardless of which group you're in, right? So it's one of these things you have to contend with. It's nice to think, right, that Democrats versus Republicans is just the forces of good versus the forces of evil, and I know that I'm on the side that is good, right? That's kind of oversimplifying things a little bit when we think that way, right? Um, yeah, that's just one example. You can come up with other examples as well. It can also be my race, right? The group that is my race. When you identify strongly with that, right? That's how we get things like white supremacy, right? Where it's basically, this is my group. I'm proud of it. It's inherently better than these other groups. Right? But it can take all sorts of different forms. And sometimes because we identify with our own group so strongly, and then when we look at other groups, right, we look at them in ways that distort the truth sometimes. We might lump people together and oversimplify, right? Uh, every person is unique, but sometimes you think, okay, well, this person belongs in this social category, right? Whether that's race or religion or gender, right? You can group things in all sorts of different ways. And you go, here's this individual person. They belong in this group, right? The group of whatever ethnicity, the group of uh, Muslims, the group of women, the group of whatever it is, fill in the blanks. You belong to this group, and I think of this group in a certain way, right? You might have stereotypes, right, that you associate with that group. And so just because that person belongs in that group, you end up making assumptions about that person. Now, sometimes there really are things that are associated with certain cultures, right? Uh, there are when it comes to stereotypes, some stereotypes somewhat apply. But what does that mean? That does not mean every single member of that group, right? And that's the thing to remember here, that groups are comprised of individuals and nobody's exactly the same. And you cannot predict for certain what someone is going to be like because they belong to that group. You just have to sort of see the person as just a person, right? But we distort the truth about other people when we simplify like this, lump people together into these categories, these kind of artificial categories, where we have a lot of overly simplistic, overgeneralized thinking, right? So stereotyping It's literally, a mistake in reasoning. It's not smart to stereotype. So we often take the moral the moral route, right? We just say, hey, it's wrong to stereotype. But it's not just wrong to stereotype, it's kind of stupid, right? Moral and cognitive. Okay. We're almost halfway done here. The toughest mental obstacles, these are these deeply ingrained psychological things. Well, all the other ones have also been like that as well, really. The way that the textbook organizes these is kind of a little bit arbitrary, in my opinion. In general, you should proportion your degree of confidence in a claim or a belief according to the strength of evidence for that claim or belief, right? That's why I said last time I talked about it's not always so black and white of can you know for sure that this is true or false? Sometimes we just have to say, well, there's a lot of evidence for this, and there's not a lot of evidence for this. So this is just more likely to be true, right? And so you kind of say, well, how much am I going to believe this? Well, you're going to believe it more, right? You're going to believe it harder if there's more evidence for it. And you're not going to hold as much credence in it if there's very little evidence for it, right? So you proportion the two. How much evidence and how much confidence. And again, your feelings about it, right? Don't really enter into it unless it is about your feelings, right? Uh, I hope we made that clear in the previous section there. Right? So how much you already believe it is not evidence. Right? And that's just true in general. It's hard for us to process that sometimes. Sometimes you're just so sure that something is true that that feeling of certainty actually takes the place of actual evidence or reasons. Sometimes you don't even have evidence or reasons. You just feel certain, right? Well, a feeling of certainty does not indicate truth. You can be very certain about things and be mistaken, right? Is what we're trying to say here. And so there might be contexts where faith and trust, right, are correct or valid, right? But sometimes we have to act in the absence of overwhelming evidence. We just have to do something. And that's okay. Sometimes we're just caught in that position, right? But faith does not tell you that the thing is true, right? Faith, when it's rational, just sort of means, well, I can't fully know for certain, but I got to make a decision in my life, and I have to choose whether I'm going to believe this or not. I don't know. I'm just going to put my faith in this answer, right? That could be rational. That could be okay to do. But I'm just reminding you that the fact that you have faith in this proposition or this claim or this belief, that has no bearing on is it actually true, right? Again, there are these weird kind of are they maybe exceptions? I don't think so once you truly understand what we're trying to say, but you might, there's certain things, we kind of referenced this earlier already, right? But there's a saying in psychology, if you want to be a certain type of person, but you just don't know how to, right? Well, you just start behaving like that. And then eventually it lines up with your own character. Eventually you really become that person, right? But just start doing the things that you envision yourself as being someone who does those things naturally, even when you're not doing them naturally yet. But if you keep doing it, then it'll become second nature to you, right? Or the placebo effect, where just believing that something is medicine will help uh, whatever's wrong with you, and therefore it becomes medicine, right? So if you have a headache, and a doctor can give you a little sugar pill that has nothing in it that's really going to affect you, but the doctor says, here, take this will help, and you take the sugar pill, even though the chemicals don't do anything for your headache at all. The chemicals don't do anything, but because you believe that it's medicine that's going to help your headache, it will literally help your headache. Like, the placebo effect is real. This is a well-studied phenomena. The placebo effect is so strong that people can even be told that it's a placebo, right? And it'll still work. Right? So here's a case where believing something very strongly makes it kind of true, right? But of course, it doesn't mean that the sugar pill really has ingredients that help your headache. No, it doesn't. It does not have any ingredients that help your headache. That doesn't become true because you believe it to be medicine that works. Right? So I hope that's not too confusing. Right? There are some cases where believing something strongly enough kind of makes it come true. But most of the time, it's not like that, right? Most of the time, it's just a factual question. Is this true or false, right? Okay. And then faith might come into play in some situations where there's not enough evidence, but you got to decide, or you got to trust something or somebody. Sometimes that makes sense to do. But the fact that you have faith or trust does not make it any more likely to actually be true. Confirmation bias is a huge, huge one. So this is, again, one of these ways in which we're wired, that we pay attention to evidence that seems to confirm whatever we already believe, right? Especially if it's something that you like to believe in, like we talked about earlier, right? It's a cherished belief, right? Or you get a lot of comfort from the belief, right? Then we will ignore evidence that conflicts with it, and will pounce on evidence that affirms it or confirms it. Right? We're just wired like this. Right? We want to see the patterns. It's difficult for us to think about it differently, where we see the disruption in patterns. Right? Rather, we just want to see what we already believe, and then we don't look at things that conflict with that. Right? We look for confirmations of patterns rather than disconfirmations. So there's a famous test here that you can do. Okay. It's the Wazen selection task. So each card has a number on one side and a color on the other. Okay, we know that's true. Okay, so those three, those eights, they have some color behind them, right? The blue and the red, they have some number on the other side. Okay. Now let's say there's somebody says these cards obey a particular rule. The rule is, if a card shows an even face on one side, then its opposite face must be blue. Well, if you want to test that rule, right? Is that person telling the truth? Right? You've got to be a critical thinker here, right? This person says, hey, there's this rule that these cards follow, right? Whenever there's an even on one side, then the other side is blue, right? Whenever there's an even, there's a blue. Even, blue. Okay? Now, in order to discover whether or not that statement is true, which cards do you need to flip over? Okay. Is there just one? Is it two? Is it all four? Right. What's the minimum cards that you need to flip over to discover whether or not that statement is true? That whenever there's even on one side, there's blue on the other side. Right? How will you figure this out? Which ones do you turn over? Right? Now, I wish we could do this in real life, but I'll tell you, most people, when they first do this test, get it wrong. And that includes PhDs, right? Doctors, professors, mathematics professors. Right? People get this wrong, right? Across the whole board. Right? It doesn't matter your level of education. People tend to just get this wrong. Okay? If you want to know the answer, you'll just have to email me or something like that, or go look it up. But I'm telling you that what people end up doing is they end up looking for that pattern, right? They hear even and blue. So what most people think is that you got to turn over 8 and blue in order to discover whether or not the rule is true or whether there is an exception to the rule. Because we're wired for confirmation bias. We hear the pattern 8 one side, blue the other side, then we look for confirming instances, right? Because if we have the 8 and then we see blue on the other side, we go, that confirms it, right? Okay. And then we see the blue, and then if we turn it the other way around and it has an even on it, then we think, that confirms it. But no, that's incorrect. Right? The blue one is irrelevant because it only says if there's an even number on one side, then the opposite face must be blue. It must be blue. It doesn't say what happens when there's an even number. So blue could easily have, an odd number. Blue could easily have an odd number on the other side, and it would not have any effect. It would not tell us one way or the other, right? So if blue has an odd number, the rule still has not been broken. It only says when there's an even on one side, then the opposite face has to be blue. It doesn't say what happens when there is an odd number. If there's an odd number, could the other side be blue? Sure. Nothing in this rules that out. So the blue one, you don't have to touch it at all, right? Because it doesn't tell you any information. Sure, it confirms it, but it doesn't really matter if the other option doesn't disconfirm it. Right? And that's the unnatural thing. We look for confirmation rather than disconfirmation, right? So what? I guess I will tell you the answer. You should do 8, right? People get that right. 8 is right because if we get a non-blue, if we get red on the other side, that breaks the rule. Then we know that the rule is false. Right? So we do have to uncover 8. Right? The other one we have to uncover is red. Right? Because if red has an even number on the other side, then it shows that the rule was false because it'll be even on one side and the opposite face is not blue, it's red. So the correct ones to turn over are 8 and red, not 8 and blue. Some people also picked other combinations, but mostly people like to look at 8 and blue because those are the two things that they heard, right? When the ones that we should uncover are 8 and red. And it's specifically in order to see if there's a break to the rule. Has the rule been broken? Right? Instead of, is the rule being obeyed? What people naturally do is the rule being obeyed? Let me check 8 and let me check blue. What you should be looking for is, has the rule been disobeyed? Has it been broken? And the only cards that will tell you that are 8 and red. Okay. If you didn't get that, that's all right. I don't want to spend too much time explaining that. It's just a famous example, right? Even if you don't get it, you can just remember this. Here is a famous test that stumps everybody, and it's because we are wired to detect patterns, right? Rather than disconfirmations of the patterns or breaks in the patterns. So this goes all the way back to Socrates, really, one of the first great philosophers that we think of as the philosopher, right? Even though Socrates himself didn't write anything down, there's this thing that he does where Socrates will ask people for a definition. This all comes from Plato, right? Plato was Socrates' student. He wrote all this stuff down, right? His kind of memories of Socrates, what Socrates would do when he questioned people, because that's what Socrates would do. He'd walk around barefoot in Athens and question people. And he would often ask for a definition, right? And then the person would give a definition, and Socrates would come up with counterexamples, right? He would say, well, that definition sounds nice, and I can see some examples that are like that, but what about this example, right? That disconfirms it. Whereas the person who had the definition, they're probably just thinking of the confirming instances of this. They're just thinking of when that definition is correct, right? And maybe sometimes it is, but not always, right? Because Socrates comes up with these counterexamples, things that break the pattern. And science perfects this, really, right? This is how science works. There's of course, a whole process to it, but there's kind of this emphasis on coming up with a theory that's phrased in such a way that we can test it and we could rule it out as false if we can find something, right? And that's generally why we think a theory is a good theory, is because it has still not been falsified, right? But that's what you do when you're a scientist, right? That's why science works only as a community of scientists, because the individual scientists or a group of scientists will do some research and they'll come up with some sort of theory, right? And then they show it to their peers, they show it to everybody else. And what is everyone else going to try to do? Are they going to try to find evidence for your theory? No, 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 no. They're going to try to pick it apart. They're going to try to destroy your theory. Right? That's how science works, right? You come up with something and you throw it to the wolves, right? All the other science will try to debunk your hypothesis or your theory, whatever stage we're at, right? They're going to try to debunk it. The scientists themselves who wrote it have already tried to do that, right? But that's why they're presenting it. They've already tried to do the work of falsifying it. They couldn't, right? And then everybody else tries to. And whatever survives that process of disproving, that's what we're going to say, this is our best science right now at the moment, right? And science doesn't tend to want to say we have found the absolute truth for all eternity. It's usually, here's our best model, our best guess, our best explanation, right? Here's what survived this gauntlet of everyone trying to disprove it, right? So that's how we make knowledge advancement in knowledge, right? And Socrates showed us how to do that in philosophy, and science shows us how to do that in the scientific context, right? That we try to disprove a theory more than trying to prove it. And that's what proves it, is that we haven't disproven it, right? I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but it's again this thing where science didn't just exist from the beginning of humanity. We had to figure this out, and this was a big piece of the puzzle, right? Is that instead of building theories that conform to the evidence, we instead build theories that we can test conclusively, that if they were to be false, then we can show that they're false, right? You phrase it in that way to be able to falsify it. We often fall prey to motivated reasoning, right? When you're committed already to a certain point of view, right, it's very much related to confirmation bias, right? But it might be even more of a conscious process where you're really just, you're not really interested in the truth as this ultimate abstract goal of, I'm a kind of person who wants to know the truth. No, it's more, I want to protect my belief. This is my belief, for the statement that I want to believe in it. Right? Then the way that you reason about it, it's motivated in a certain way, right? It's motivated uh, towards, again, yourself, right? Going back to that idea. The notion of belief perseverance is also related to this. This is not in the textbook, but I added it. But this is a big one as well, right? That's the fact that we've had a belief for a long time itself will play a role in how we think about that belief. You're less likely to revise that belief or to really take seriously that it could be wrong if you've already had that belief for a long time, right? So you might cling to the belief even in the face of clear contrary information, right? So hopefully you can see how these are all kind of related to one another, and they're often different ways of saying the same thing. The availability error, or sometimes the availability heuristic, right? Uh, the things that we end up believing, right, of all the stuff, all the noise that we hear out there in the world, all this potential information, the stuff that really gets into our head and that often is what we end up believing. And sometimes just an idea is just there in your head, right? You don't really know if you believe it or not. You just heard it. But the ideas that stick with us the most, and therefore are going to be the most likely candidate for things that you believe, right? They're going to likely end up being put on your map of the world, right? It's out of all these beliefs, it's the ones that are the most memorable in some way right? Because they're the most exciting or the most scary, or they just stand out in the way that they make us feel psychologically, right? They stand out against all the rest of the noise, and we block everything else out, and then we are likely to have those things in our minds. Even if we don't totally fully believe them yet, still, those are the things that end up in your mind, right? So there's a nice little diagram here, right? This is all the available information that is there, that's out there for you to think about, for you to come up with your conclusion, right? What do you think is actually true? But then what you end up using to make a decision is this very small subset of all the information, right? It's all the more exciting stuff. Just the stuff that sticks in your mind the most because of whatever psychological reason. Like it's the most recent thing you heard, right? It's the most fresh thing in your mind. That's what ends up there. It's something you've heard the most. It's something that's very extreme, or there's some sort of vividness to it, or it's very, very negative, right? It stands out in some way. Whatever, the processes are that make you remember something more easily, that's what we end up relying on many times. So you might think about, like if you have a fear of flying, right? It's very likely because you've heard about plane crashes and it's kind of terrifying, right? When it's on the news, uh, and there's sure you could go read some actual statistics that show that it's actually pretty safe. It's much safer than driving in a car, right? But that's just words. It's not very memorable. But that crash, right, where you saw maybe the airplane go down and there's flames and people died and right, it just makes a lot of noise versus all the more boring data, right? We end up believing or making decisions based on the things that make the most noise, right? Uh, like that's a big thing now, right? Fears about immigrants, right? There's some story about an immigrant murdering somebody, and it's some innocent person, and it is, of course, horrible, right? But this can distort our thinking, right? Because we mostly maybe remember that, right? And then this fosters a fear of immigrants, and then we're off to the races, right? Uh, yeah. Versus, being educated about the actual rates and things like that. Politicians often use this on both sides of the political spectrum. Right? Just repeat something over and over. Right? Just say it over and over. People end up believing it. It's just one of these things. You hear it in the news. It must be true. Right? Even if we don't think that consciously, it's very easy for that to happen. When something just you hear something over and over, and think about it. Think of a president. It doesn't have to be the current one, but there's plenty of good examples, but there's examples all throughout history, right? Where you just say something over and over, and that makes it into the news. And now, hey, I heard on the news that blah, 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 right? We kind of trust the news, and we end up believing it, right? But the only thing that's there is repetition, right? Sometimes it's not based on any evidence at all that the thing wasn't actually true. Maybe it's demonstrably false. But who goes and does all that fact checking, right? And, it's more boring than just hearing whatever you hear on the news. So the availability heuristic, shows up in a lot of different ways, right? Or you read some article about becoming a millionaire overnight with cryptos, right? And then you look at the actual reality of how this actually works. But you might just remember this person went from rags to riches, and it might put all sorts of fantastical ideas in your head about the promises of this thing, right? But then maybe it turns out it's very unlikely that sort of thing happens, right? Now maybe it ends up being true. That's not really the point. It isn't necessarily that whatever you believe through the availability heuristic is false. Not necessarily. It just means certain things make more noise than other things, but the fact that they make more noise does not mean that it's more likely to be true, right? That's the thing here. That's the takeaway. Okay, and I think we're going to stop Afterbane on social media. I don't think we'll see. We'll see how fast this goes. Social media definitely presents new challenges, although in many cases it's old ones put in a new context, right? New wine in old wineskins. That's the biblical saying, right? We're just more likely to believe what our friends share on social media, right? Even though it goes back to that group thinking, right? It's the same thing, but now it's just in an online setting, right? But this is called homophily, right? It's where you are drawn towards the things that are closest to your own group, your own circle, right? And it's just something in our minds do that. Begin because we're social creatures, we belong to groups, right? Sometimes people talk about echo chambers, right? That's the same kind of an idea here. The mere exposure effect, right? It's one form of the availability heuristic, really, right? Just being exposed to a certain idea over and over makes you more likely to believe it, right? Not that it's true, right? It's not that you had good reasons to believe it. It's just you've heard this a bunch, right? You can so people can manipulate that in a social media context, right? So you might see an activist for social political causes, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. Like oftentimes they're professional debaters, right? They're part of a political movement and they have like their little spiel, they have their arguments ready to go, right? And what they do is they film interactions, right? So if you are one of these people and you're on one side of the political spectrum and then you're arguing with somebody else, right? Sometimes you're arguing with young college students who don't really know what they're talking about yet. And then you film the worst interactions where the other side looks the worst, right? But, if you put those videos, uh, you clip farm, you put those videos online, and then people see that over and over and over, and it's a kind of a propaganda approach, right? You make people just think, oh, people on that side of the political spectrum are really stupid because they keep showing these interactions specifically, right? They don't show the other interactions, right? They don't show the ones where the person they're talking to does know what they're talking about, right? They're not going to show those. Only going to show the clips that make them look good, that makes their political side look good, that makes the other side look bad. But just putting those clips online makes people believe them, right? And so you got to be really, really careful, right? That this is not happening to you. Just being exposed to something over and over, right, can make you view the world in a certain way, but it's not necessarily based on reality. Right? They call it clip farming. The illusion of truth effect. Uh, so, I hope you see all the overlaps. They're all kind of slightly different ways of saying sometimes similar things, right? We tend to believe ideas more just because they're familiar. Right? They've done studies on this, right? Where they did these interactions with groups over a couple of days, right? On one day, they showed them a bunch of statements, right? And then later on, they tested them again and they gave him a list of a bunch of statements, some of the statements that they were shown earlier, right? And a bunch of other statements. And were asked, which ones do you think are true? How likely do you think they're true? And if they had seen those statements, it has a huge impact on how much truth they ascribe to those beliefs. Right? They'll ascribe much more truth to those beliefs than the new ones. Right? Even though the only reason for that is they were shown those ideas before without knowing if they were true or false. Right? They were just shown them, and then when they were tested, the people went, a great percentage of them, a statistically significant amount, not all of them, but statistically significant. A lot of people in general, tended to ascribe more truth or believability to those statements. It has nothing to do with are there good reasons to believe that they're true. It just has to do with the fact that they had seen them before. Right? So, and none of us is immune to this, right? We all do this. The best thing to do is to become aware of it. Being on social media creates a kind of a bubble, right? Echo chamber effect, bubble effect. It gives you the impression that most people believe the same thing, right? That when you think about society out there, you kind of think, most people just believe the things that I see every day. And then maybe there's like a fringe minority of wackos who believe something different, right? So if your friends all have the same political views as you, then you're going to get a lot of stories and articles and memes and opinions being shared that reflect those views, right? That reflect that political view, that political outlook. And you're not going to be exposed as much to other points of view unless you actively look for them, right? Yeah, that you can do that, but most people don't. Most people stay within their echo chamber, right? And that can create this illusion, right? Because you are seeing all these things that confirm your political stance. Again, you can use uh, these techniques that we just looked at, right? Like clip farming. That's one way that you get that as well. That just confirm to you my political side is sane and right and just, and the other side, they are crazy and stupid. And that's only some people. Most of us are not weird like that, right? And this can happen on both sides of the political aisle, and not just here in America. So there's no real statement about I'm not making a real political statement here. I'm making a statement about human psychology that's universal. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a very interesting one. It's There's this general tendency, right, that people who are least informed on a topic are often highly confident in their knowledge of it, right? That people, it's this inverse thing where, you think if you don't know something, you don't have a lot of confidence that you know it. But that's not the way it works, right? People, the least informed people, the people who know the least about a particular topic, are often the most vocal and aggressive and confident that they are right, right? And this is confirmed by many scientific studies that show this, right? This is a quote here. Dunning-Kruger effect, in sum, means that the dumber you are, the more confident you are that you're not actually dumb. That's not a nice way of saying it, but that's sort of what it is, right? Dunning and Kruger, the researchers, label those people as unskilled or incompetent, right? So you're unskilled in some field, you're not competent, right? Maybe car mechanics, right? How cars work and all that stuff, right? Maybe you're unskilled. I am unskilled, and I'm sure the Dunning-Kruger effect applies to me in other areas. Not there. I'll gladly say I don't know anything about cars at all, but that's just an example, right? You could be unskilled and incompetent there, but the people will be highly, highly confident that they're actually pretty good at it. That doesn't change their central finding. Not only do they reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices, but their incompetence robs them of the ability to realize it. Right? It's kind of a funny, ironic situation, right? And then it's funny too because often aggressive, confident people do get somewhere in life, right? More so than people who are not confident and not aggressive. So often these people become successful by sheer persistence and confidence. Okay, here's some class exercises. So you should just pause this if you're watching the video. Okay, so I'm not going to linger on this. Just go through each one of them, right? Read the main claim, right? And then see which of these statements support that claim, right? Is this a good reason? Right? Right. So the first one, someone says the newspaper account of the charges of pedophilia lodged against Father J. Miller, a Catholic priest in our town, should never have been printed. Right. Someone's taking a stance. Right. That's what we would call a conclusion in an argument. Well, what would be an appropriate premise for this argument? Right. What could you say in support that shows that there is a truth to this claim? Right. That this should never have been printed. These charges of pedophilia. Right? They shouldn't have been printed, right? That's the claim that's being made. Well, what's a good reason for accepting that? go through each of those statements and identify them, right? Some of them, in some cases, none of them are good reasons. So you're going to have to figure this out, right? Which ones are good reasons to accept that first claim, right? And then just do these ones as a separate exercise. Okay. So again, just pause it if you're watching the video. I'm just going to quickly finish this off. Okay. This is philosophical obstacles. You have a worldview. We all do. And it's possible that there's certain philosophical ideas in there that maybe you haven't fully thought through, that maybe have a core of truth to them, but they can sometimes lead you astray. They can undermine critical thinking if you don't think about these things carefully. And in many cases, there might be a core of truth or some exceptions, right? But if you take these things in a certain way, they're just very problematic. So one of them is subjective relativism. And this is something that people do sometimes argue, but I don't think they think it through, right? This is the idea that a belief is only true relative to the person that believes it, right? That if someone believes something, then it's true for them. But that's the only kind of truth that exists, right? We could maybe come up with some examples where believing something makes it true for you. Maybe we could come up with a few examples, right? I usually try to find some counterexamples. But this is subjective relativism is not making that claim that this is sometimes okay or that sometimes happens. This is saying there really is no objective truth at all. There's no truth at all except for what you think is true. And that exhausts the notion of truth, that there's nothing else to say beyond that. Something is either true because you believe it for yourself, or something is true for somebody else because they believe that for themselves. So maybe what people sometimes I think are just people are trying to be tolerant and open-minded, and maybe they're thinking of cases where we don't necessarily know the truth, right? Maybe they're just thinking in a certain area of thoughts, right? Maybe religion is like that. Maybe somebody thinks, well, we can't figure out the ultimate truth about religion, but if the religion works for you, right? If it gives you meaning and fulfillment, right? Then that's your truth, right? I can kind of see that, right? We're kind of using truth in a slightly metaphorical way, not in a literal way, right? Does that actually match reality? But more, well, you have this religious belief system, and that seems to work for you. Let's say it's true for you. Right? That's, so maybe we want to be tolerant. But notice, we're already using the word truth in kind of a metaphorical way there, not in a literal way, right? The problem is that if all there is to truth is just what individual people believe, then there's no real notion of reliable information that you can look up, right? Or any objective facts at all, or just publicly demonstrable truths, things that we can just know are true, right? I have a dog, okay? I invite you to my home and come meet my dog. I can show you that I do have a dog, okay? If you believe that I don't have a dog, okay, we can say that's true for you. We can say that's your truth. But it is false, right? I do have a dog. You're not going to tell me that I don't really, or that it's only a belief, right? Some things are just true or false, right? And belief doesn't tell you whether it's true or false. So again, I'm saying that, but remember that I'm saying there might be some kind of quasi exceptions. But if we just say all truth is completely subjective, then we run into these problems. Right? The fact that airplanes can fly depends on objective facts that we know about the laws of physics. And we have to know about them because that's how we can make the airplanes work, right? The airplanes work because we know how physics works. If you somehow find some person that doesn't believe in the laws of physics, that doesn't mean that it's true for them and that that's just as valid as the people that have done the hard work of figuring out how physics works so they can build airplanes that work, right? No, these are not on equal footing. They're not equally true. Even if we want to make room for some sort of true for you idea, it's just not the same thing, right? And completely gets rid of the distinction between belief and knowledge. Right? We couldn't say that we have real scientific knowledge because some person down the street's opinion is just as valid as the knowledge that we get through science or mathematical knowledge, right? Uh, 2 plus 2 equals 4 would be on the same footing as 2 plus 2 equals 5. None would be more true or false or more believable or anything. Like, there's just no metric anymore. There's no standard at all anymore, right? Why even use the word truth at that point? So, like, I talked about my dog. Think about your own life. Think about the facts of your life. Think about pain that you felt. Right? You really want to say that if someone believed something different about your life, that they are just as correct as you who's actually lived through it? No, right? You can have real knowledge of real things that goes beyond just subjective belief. Right? I assume that everyone shares this belief that you've never murdered anybody. Uh, you know, I assume that's true for everybody. I don't know, but I assume your belief that you never murdered anyone would be just as true as someone else's belief that you are a murderer, right? No, your knowledge of the fact that you're not a murderer is true, right? That's actually matches reality. Where somebody just believes that you're a murderer, that doesn't make it true. At least some beliefs. Again, maybe there's some more, just gray area, but there are some beliefs at least that just correspond to objective reality that we can all see and check on, right? And some don't. Beliefs can be true or false. If every belief is equally true, then there is no distinction between true or false. And if you're still not convinced, subjective relativism contradicts itself. It undermines itself by being self contradictory. Because here's the question: is subjective relativism objectively true? If it's objectively true, then it's false, right? Because subjective relativism says there is no objective truth. If subjective relativism is objectively true, then we have an exception, right? Then subjective relativism is not correct because subjective relativism says everything is relative to subjects, right? Everything is subjective. Well, there would be one truth that's not subjective. Right? If it is subjective, right? Uh, if it isn't objectively true, then somebody could just believe the opposite. Then that would be just as true. Right? So, if subjective relativism is just a subjective truth, then the opposite view it would be just as true, and then it's kind of meaningless to say that subjective relativism is right. Right. So, in order for us to believe in subjective relativism, it would have to be correct, but it completely gets rid of the idea of being objectively correct or incorrect. Some things are objective, right? So delight or disgust in response to the idea of pineapple on pizza, right? Do you like pineapple on pizza? How does that make you feel? Well, it depends on the person, right? But interestingly, even subjective things like that become objective truths about that subject, about that person, right? It is an objective fact about you. If you like pineapple on pizza, right, that is an objective truth that we can say about you, about your subjective taste. Right? So even when we acknowledge subjectivity, we don't get rid of objectivity. Okay, almost done here. Social relativism is very similar, right? It just says that a belief is true relative to the society that you happen to be in, right? Uh, truth. A belief is only true relative to the believer's society. Different societies teach different things, and there's no fact of the matter beyond what a particular society deems as true. This also, can sound tolerant at first, right? But it faces the same issues as subjective relativism does. Uh, there do seem to be some truths and facts, regardless of what human beings believe, right? That the shape of the Earth, and even though here in 2026 people are arguing about this on the internet, but there's going to be a fact of the matter that the Earth is going to be roughly what science tells us, kind of spherical, not exactly, a little lumpy, right? But that's the general shape, or it's not, right? If it's flat, like flat Earth theory says, that's an objective difference, right? So the Earth either is the shape that it is or it isn't. And if one society believes it's flat and another believes that it's round, spherical, it's not somehow both, right? It's just not, doesn't work like that. There's objective realities. If social relativism is right, then you can't really say that it was wrong to have slavery, right? Uh, well, that's just what the society believed was okay at the time, right? Then there's no standpoint from which to condemn that in the first place, right? Thankfully, the society that had slavery is the same society that questioned it and that said, no, even though as a society this is being condoned and people are okay with it, we should not be okay with it, right? Well, if social relativism is right, those people should have shut their mouth, right? They should have just gone with what the society said, right? But we don't think of it that way. We think we've made real progress by getting rid of slavery. There's still a lot of issues, but that's some progress that we've made. But if social relativism is right, there's no real progress. Everything is sort of equally right, equally wrong. Use some other example, right? If the society thought that the common cold was caused by people with black hair casting spells, right? So that all the black haired people get vilified and they become a scapegoat, right? Well, that's going to be just as true as what modern science tells us about how the cold actually works. And that would seem a little bit silly, right? There wouldn't really be any truly false beliefs, right? Because it's all just relative to the culture, and we don't have an external standard of truth at all. We also have this problem, right? What defines your society? You think about this, right? If social relativism was right, then you should believe what American society believes. What does American society believe? Or is that not society? Maybe your society is California, right? Or maybe it's the West. Well, what is? How do you even define what your society is? And then, if you do define it, right? Well, people believe different things within a single society, right? People have different takes on things. So you don't really get a clear answer of this is what the society believes. Societies are comprised of many individuals who have different opinions about things, right? Um, And there's again the undermining self contradiction problem, right? What if there's a society that doesn't believe in social relativism, right? That they would be just as right, right? They would be just as right as the society that believes it. And so social relativism, then it wouldn't be any more correct or true than any alternative. Right? And again, if this is all just about being tolerant towards other societies, well, then actually you shouldn't be a social relativist, right? You can be tolerant towards other societies and be sensitive to cultural differences. But the thing is, uh, if a society were to say, hey, we don't want to do that, right? If a society were to say, we are going to be imperialistic, we're going to take over other areas and we're going to force them to believe what we believe. Well, if that's the society's belief, then you can't question it according to this theory, right? Especially if that's your own society. So think about that, right? That if it's really a concern about imperialism or something like that, then well, is imperialism wrong? Is it right? Well, there wouldn't be a fact about it. It would just depend on what your society believed. Some of this philosophical stuff, if it's if it's it might not even be your cup of tea, right? You might not think about any of this stuff. And that's fine. This is sort of a thing tagged at the end, and we're just about done here. Philosophical skepticism. That's the idea. Oh, I got too much in there. Oh well. That we only ever have belief. That we can't ever go beyond belief to knowledge. Right? And in a certain way, those previous two lead you to skepticism, right? Subjective relativism and social relativism kind of get rid of the idea of objective knowledge altogether, and all you're left with is a personal belief or a social belief. Right? So those two options kind of lead you to philosophical skepticism. But there's different forms of skepticism, so we have to be careful, right? There's scientific skepticism, which makes a little bit more sense. If somebody makes a claim about the natural world, then we can be skeptical about that in an appropriate way, and that means we're going to test it, right? We're going to use scientific methods to figure out if it's true or false. That kind of skepticism is totally okay. But the philosophical skepticism that's being talked about here is a kind of global skepticism, right? Where knowledge is simply just impossible. And the reason that you end up in this position is if your idea of knowledge involves certainty, right? If you think knowledge means you have to be completely certain, right? If there's any room for doubt at all, then you just don't know it. But that's one definition of knowledge, right? That's a certain conception of it. You don't need to have such a high standard for knowledge. You could just say, well, this is the most probable thing, right? So you don't have to necessarily know with absolute certainty that you couldn't possibly be wrong. You could just say, we have a lot of evidence for this. This is the most probable thing, right? And if that's a reliable belief that we all live according to, then we can count it as knowledge, right? So our knowledge of the physics that allows airplanes to work is knowledge because it actually works, right? Uh, is it possible that we're living in a simulation and those laws of physics don't describe ultimate reality? Hey, in philosophy, right? If we say it's possible, right? You can't rule it out, right? But that's too high of a standard for knowledge, right? So this is the world we live in. There are certain things that we can know, even if we can have a little bit of room for doubt. We can still say, here is knowledge. Or we can, at the very least, aim for knowledge, right? So knowledge can still be our ideal, even if we don't want to say too quickly, I've got knowledge, cool it on that, but just sort of say, I seek knowledge. I want to know that something's true. And that means something like the thing is true and you've got outstanding reasons for believing it, right? So I take myself to know that I'm sitting on a chair here because I have outstanding reasons for believing it, even though, there's always some alternate possibility that I'm in the matrix or something like that, right? Uh, I can't rule it out completely, right? But it's still, given all the data available, that's the most likely inference. It's the most probable thing. And then we can call it knowledge, right? At the very least, we can keep knowledge as an ideal, right? That what we want is the truth that is well supported and that it's a reliable truth. So just to close everything out, this is the last thing, right? Just again, a word about skepticism and about how we actually live life, right? If we're on a walk together and we need to cross a street, it'd be kind of silly to not cross the street because you don't know with absolute certainty that there aren't some invisible cars coming, right? Maybe, we're getting to the future. Maybe someday that's going to be possible. Maybe it's already possible. Do you know for certain that there are no invisible cars, right? Uh, if we don't see any cars coming, though, we can treat it as safe to cross, right? We can say it's safe to cross as knowledge. It's a reliable indicator, right? If there's completely no cars coming, then we can say it's going to be safe to cross, even if we can't completely logically rule out invisible cars, right? So real life demands action, and in some cases, we get it right on the basis of good evidence, and we can call that knowledge. Okay, let's stop there. That's an hour and 20 minutes. That's actually a pretty good time. That's like a normal class session, so that's good. All right. Thank you, Janice, and I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but thank you for showing up. I always love it when there's even just one person makes a huge difference to me. So I really appreciate that you are here because I just see the name. makes me feel like I'm talking to a real person in real life, so I don't
Yeah, no
go
problem.
crazy as much. What's that? Say that again.
I said no problem. That was a
Okay, good. I'm glad. All right. Well, have a nice rest of your day, and I'm going to close out now.
thank you.
All right. Thank you.